All right. Please welcome our next speaker, Amelia Andersdotter, who will talk about adventures in hardware standardization.
Yeah, so I'm back, and today I have slides. So for everyone who likes pictures, that's very good news. This is a table of contents which doesn't actually list the first 3 slides because I ended up having formatting problems. I'll be talking about some good news from hardware standardization, where companies are trying to address real privacy problems that we have had in wireless local area networks in particular. And then I'll be talking about some bad news, which is that other companies are trying to make real tangible privacy and security improvements in mobile networks, but they're not allowed to continue those endeavors from their political masters. I'll also be trying to cover some ideas about what we can do as a community to ensure that good developments get the policy support that they need, and that bad developments get the type of counter-pushes that they deserve. But first I wanted to talk a bit about the organization that has enabled me to be here today to talk about this topic. Article 19. It's a UK-based freedom of speech organization that has for 5 years been running a program on human rights and technical standards. So the work of Article 19 starts from this idea of, which is really formulated by Kranzberg in the 1980s, that technology might be neither good or bad, but it's also not neutral. So if technologies aren't neutral, that means from the perspective of human rights, that technical design also matters. We try to introduce diversity into the technical design process and a focus on human rights values and what they mean for engineers and how engineers can reflect upon human rights when they are making the next generation of internet products, let's say. We've been doing work in a range of organizations over these years. We started out at the Internet Engineering Task Force, IETF, and ICANN, which of course deals with the DNS system, back in 2014. Since then, the activities have been expanded into the Institute of Electric and Electronical Engineers, the 3GPP, which does mobile network standards, and also the International Telecommunications Union, which is a United Nations body that roughly they're responsible for land area codes and telephone numbers. We've been working on developing human rights considerations that are meant to assist the technical design process. In the IETF, we have RFC 8280, which codifies human rights considerations for protocol developers. And in the IEEE, we have these privacy recommendations, which are still in a draft form, but they've been making big advancements in the last 2 years, and we're hoping that at least in the next year, couple of years, they might make it into a final kind of standards format where they can be actually applied and referred to as an authoritative IEEE document. But I want to give some words of caution about considerations and technical design processes. One of them is that standards are not mandatory. All standards that are made are voluntary for private sector parties to apply or not. Developing the standards in spite of this limitation takes time, money, and commitment. In many cases, technical standards are simply written by those who show up. So those that have the money to have a lot of engineers to attend standards bodies and make proposals and research what various different aspects and developments need to be inserted to make next generation technologies. But then there is a final kind of challenge of working with standards, is that even if you have the most perfect standard ever written, and it takes into account all of the human rights and privacy considerations you could imagine, the fact is your standard is not impactful if it's not implemented. So at Article 19, we try to have this holistic approach where it's true that if the technology is not designed to respect human rights, probably human rights will not be respected by deploying the technology. But also, only having the design in place is not enough. You need to have this holistic approach to the entire process of a product, from design to market. That sounds like I'm a marketing consultant, but bear with me. Yeah. So my work for the past 2 years with Article 19 has been mostly oriented towards hardware standards. That means I have worked a lot in IEEE 802 with the standard that is formally called wireless local area networks, but in practice, most of us encounter it in our day-to-day lives as Wi-Fi. So Wi-Fi is actually a brand. It's maintained by the Wi-Fi Alliance, which is a separate organization from the IEEE 802, but I think for conceptual purposes, it's fine to think of IEEE 802.11 as a Wi-Fi standards body. For the past 7 months or so, I've also been following 3GPP, which is the third generation partnership project. It's like this big global organization of mobile network equipment manufacturers, telecommunications operators, and a few others, including governments, as we will see. And they make mobile network standards. They were originally formed to develop the 3G standard, which, or UMTS, these kind of things that were deployed way back when. Now they also deal with 4G and 5G, but they didn't update the name, and so that's why it sounds kind of anachronistic. But with that, we can move on to the good news slides. I'll try not to speak too long. There has actually been a number of good developments in the IEEE 802 group from the time that I've monitored them in 2017. One of them is the .11aq privacy enhancements amendments, which deals with some geolocational tracking issues that have been raised by researchers in privacy technologies for the past 6 or 7 years. It introduces MAC address pre-association randomization. So basically, when you're not, what it says is that your mobile phone or connected equipment should randomize its layer 2 identifier as long as you're not associated to the network. It also fixes some other things like asks the chip and the management frame not to probe for specific SSIDs, reset sequence number counters to ensure that you can't track the equipment by ancillary attacks that have been described in literature. I mean, basically, it does a lot of the privacy enhancements amendments in .11aq, which was already passed last year in June, introduces a lot of fixes to problems that have been raised persistently by researchers since 2013. So this is a very positive development. We now have a standard which describes how we could mitigate a lot of the serious privacy concerns that previously have been kind of built in to the technical architecture of our devices. I've included on this slide a link to a presentation made by one of my colleagues at 802.11, which explains the general .11aq kind of features in a more comprehensive format. I realize you may not be able to copy it from this screen, but if you contact me afterwards, I'll send you the link, and I'm sure you'll find it all very interesting. So other things that are going on with wireless local area networks, which are interesting, is scalable geolocation. This, again, comes into the tracking requirements, but it's a very well-studied problem in literature, so it's very, for me, heartening to see that privacy-enhancing technologies research is now being actually adopted by industry in their practical processes. One of them is passive ranging or passive geolocation, so basically making the geolocation of a device in a network function kind of similarly to GPS. So instead of the network figuring out where you are, the network provides you with information to help you find yourself. We had recently in the spring some advancements to modify management frames in such a way that it will be easier for an end-user device to indicate policy preferences. This is also something that's been addressed in literature. I know especially at INRIA in France, and I was very happy to see this being taken up by the group in May, although a word of caution is that it's not yet in the actual standard, it's just a proposal. The amendment is not adopted. Of course, when you work with standards at such a low level, you also need to take into account that there's a difference between a mechanism for expressing a policy and the policy as such. So you can have an indication in a management frame that you have a specific policy preference, but the IEEE 802 normally does not set, for instance, default values, or what should be, how should this bit be set when it's shipped to consumers. So I will return to this in the third section of this talk, because the fact that they define the mechanisms, but the actual defaults are then left to other processes, makes a big difference, especially in the European regulatory framework. So on to the bad news. I will actually go back to a presentation made by a Nokia Bell Labs engineer last year at the ETSI Security Week. It's an annual event organized by the European Technical Standards Institute, which was formed in the 1980s and has some form of statutory base. It's free to attend for anyone who can afford to go to the south of France for a week and chill out. But this presentation, I was there last year, I saw this being presented live, and it really alerted me to something being extremely wrong in mobile network standards organization. So Nokia Bell Labs, many of you will know as a really big company, right? Nokia is not a small institutional actor. Also Bell Labs, I would not call one of these, small and medium-sized enterprises that do not have any market leverage. So what she appears to be describing here is that there are some reality of attacks against mobile networks, which include intelligence communities, military, and law enforcement. And they're stopping our companies from developing better privacy and security mechanisms by showing up at the standards meetings and objecting to features that would otherwise protect us from being introduced. Now, actually, we have documented evidence now from Brussels institutions that this is not just at the 3GPP, that these law enforcement institutions show up. Well, so I should say also that the other significant thing about this, though, Nokia Bell Labs being a big company, if they are objecting to this, then we know, if we like privacy and security, that we have some strong allies, which aren't just, this is not just an idealistic interest. These industries are trying to make security improvements, but they are finding themselves challenged by the powers that be. And they're also challenged at the Council of Ministers. So this is a report that came from, I think, Europol and Eurojust in May of 2019, where they are trying to take the endeavors of industry to improve privacy and security all the way up to the Council of Ministers of the European Union, because they are finding industry endeavors to improve privacy and security bad, and they want it to be politically stopped. Because merely exercising resistance against such improvements in the standards organizations apparently was not good enough for them. And so this is quite serious. It's like a bizarre struggle, really, between European values and member state values. It's as if our companies have been told by the data protection regulation, for instance, that you need to protect personal data and you need to have better data security, or we will give you a 4% fine of your annual turnover for not doing your due diligence, on the one hand. But then on the other hand, you get these weird political conflicts where public authorities make angry documents with politicians saying that our life is destroyed and terrorism will happen in every corner if these companies actually act on this legislative imperative that we gave them. I interpret this to be a conflict between the slightly idealistic consumer, trade, and economics environment of Brussels pulling in one direction, whereas member states with more sinister and national security interests are pulling in another direction. And our companies, they're sort of stuck in between. They're getting pushed in both directions at the same time. There are some weird consequences of this. One of them is that end-to-end encryption is being blocked, not just by conservative companies, which can sometimes be reluctant to make changes in their architecture, but it's also blocked by telcos, who will frequently in 3GPP meetings raise objections like, we cannot do that for lawful intercept reasons, we cannot do this, we cannot do the other security improvement, because if telcos do not say that, governments can revoke their licenses and they can no longer operate on the market. For many telcos, that means real investment losses of billions of euros. So they simply can't afford to stand up to the governments in these cases. There's also some weird consequences of lawful intercept working group at 3GPP actively pushing companies to develop data maximization business models. So that's in direct contradiction with European law, actually, because data minimization is one of the core principles of European data protection law, and one of the things which, if you do not implement, you can have a 4% annual turnover fine. I found this, this second point I should mention is also, I only know of this point because I was in a meeting where this was said. So to my best of knowledge, this isn't written down anywhere, but it was a fascinating exchange between, law enforcement going, maybe you can data maximize, and industry saying, oh, it's not really foreseen. There's a third problem, which is that government authorities who participate in the 3GPP standards framework put forward proposals of really dubious dubious legality. So one of the really good examples of this is the real-time access standard, ETSI TS 102657, which enables police forces to go in real time in a telecommunications operator network and access customer data without the telco knowing. It was developed in 1997, when in most European countries, that kind of real-time access to data would not have been legal for law enforcement to do. And I know, at least in the Swedish context, we had huge discussions in 2012 about whether this technology should be legalized because it exists. So it's almost as if sometimes these government authorities that participate in 3GPP are using the platform as a reverse policy washing platform. They create the technical requirement which isn't lawful in order to be able to go to legislators and ask them to make the bad technology lawful. Industry, of course, is put in a terrible position because of this. I propose it's not useful. Yeah? Because they can't really object because they risk losing a lot of investments. So they try to make all of these diplomatic assertions like, oh, it's not foreseen, this is not great. One big mobile equipment vendor last year released a security strategy in December where they committed to making end-to-end encryption available for Internet of Things devices, because actually, how else to secure them? But they specifically do not make that commitment for end consumer communications. And I believe it's exactly because they've been put under pressure not to advance such ideas. But it also ironically means then that in their security strategy for the entire world and billions of people and devices, this mobile equipment vendor is saying that they prioritize my toothbrush more than they prioritize me. This is not a good thing. This is not a good principle upon which society should be built. And it's a terrible position, actually, for mobile network equipment vendors and operators. They are trying to do the right thing. They're just getting blocked from doing the right thing. But enough about the problems in the world. Actually, we'll come back to them at the later slide. Just kidding. Yeah. I wanted to talk a bit about optimistic views on if we have good standards, how do we get them deployed? And so I was following for some time when working in Brussels website accessibility standards, which some of you, if you work with front-end web development, you'll know about WCAG 2.0, which is a web accessibility standard. It was developed ages ago. It's been around for 20 years. And so it could have been deployed by any public sector institution in the European Union for all that time, but in practice, it hardly ever was. So what instead happened was that the European Commission launched a proposal for a directive to mandate public sector institutions to have accessible websites. It was passed in 2015 or 2016, and then in order to implement the directive, there needed to be a European harmonized standard, they call it, which is developed by ETSI. So now the European institutions are in the process of assisting in the development of this harmonized standard, which will eventually enable European public sector institutions to follow WCAG, web accessibility standards. I think this is a long and fairly tedious process, which to me is not the best effective way for the European institutions to make use of good industry developments. So I want to propose some other ways in relation actually to the wireless local area network privacy improvements that I talked about earlier. So 3 different options really for ensuring that we can make the most use of industry actors doing not terrible things. One of them is the Radio Equipment Directive. Some of you will know about it because you've been working with the Free Software Foundation Europe on dynamic frequency selection. But there's other parts of the Radio Equipment Directive too, such as Article 3.3e, privacy requirements. You should be able to find it by Googling for Radio Equipment Directive and then locating Article 3.3e. So that would basically be an ETSI-like process of being able to benefit from IEEE developments because you need to go through the entire process of a harmonized standard, and I've just told you that in website accessibility that didn't work very well. So that's why I also have some other ideas about how we can ensure that there's deployment of some of these privacy features. The first is the Data Protection Regulation, Articles 40 or 42, because they deal with codes of conduct or certification. In this case, we would need to support our data protection regulatory bodies, so Datatilsynet in Denmark or CNIL in France, the Datenschutz, I forget what they're called in Germany, and so forth, to interact with some of the industry institutions like Wi-Fi Alliance. that actually set down certification requirements for Wi-Fi equipment. This might be able to take the form of a code of conduct or a certification program, but I'm pretty sure that if we can get, if these privacy enhancing features were to be considered, data protection by design, for instance, that would be a strong incentive on industry to actually implement these features, which are already standardized. We can also support public procurements. There's the Wi-Fi for EU program, which hands out money to municipalities. So you could try to assist either the European Commission or municipalities that are trying to access this money in putting the right requirements on equipment so that they request features which are already in the standard from the vendors that sell it. I think both of the two latter points, like either the GDPR or public procurements, is a quicker way of ensuring that we can benefit from privacy standards than the radio equipment directive would be. But either of these three methods would be perfectly fine. The only challenge for somebody who does not regularly work with regulatory authorities would be that it can be a bit messy to realize exactly how you get stuff moving in the implementation of a law. Interacting with parliamentarians is easier because you just send them an email and then it's their problem. Regulatory authorities might request you to have technical knowledge or write reports, and they also have larger requirements on their work. In the 3GPP and mobile networks, I think it's more a challenge of how do we ensure that European values prevail? Because as I described, there's this struggle between the member states and the European values. And so how can you counterbalance that? It's much more tricky because national security interests normally work really long term. It's like this real-time access standard, which they passed in '97, only to make legislative proposals 15 years later. So whatever countering strategy you have for these public authorities that bully companies into not developing privacy and security, it needs to probably be like long-term. Yeah. One of the methods that I could spontaneously think of is, again, ensuring that there's counterbalancing representation in the 3GPP. So NGOs can do it like Article 19 is doing, of course. It requires a lot of resources, money, and time. 3GPP is full of big companies, so they organize meetings all the time. One could not even be in enough meetings to cover the 3GPP as one person. One would need at least 3. And so that's a challenge for NGOs. Another method of doing it is getting public authorities to start monitoring and counterbalancing other public authorities. Like data protection authorities have a real interest, I believe, in monitoring the 3GPP, especially since we appear to be having public authorities actively encouraging or even forcing companies to reflect on business models that technically are not in line with what the European law prescribes. Here again, that's mostly a question of being able to boost the self-confidence of data protection authorities, which in many European countries are full of lawyers, not of technical persons. So there's a kind of knowledge gap to be divided, to be bridged in this case. There's knowledge divide, where more people who work with the enforcement of privacy norms, especially the European ones, need to have the self-confidence that they can actually usefully defend them also at the technical standards layers. These are some of the things that I've been working with Article 19 to develop systematic approaches to. But if one is interested in working on this as well, or if you can provide technical feedback on the information that we're trying to compile, please feel free to reach out to me and I can send you some documents over email and we can talk. I think that's the last one on my slides actually, because I forgot to make the final slide. But those were the things that I wanted to propose, and I want to thank you all for your attention and time. And if you have any other questions, you can speak with me after or even ask questions now.
We do have time for questions.
I'm just thinking that the system of having standardization that is not like where you don't need to follow it is just bound to fail in some way. Because what's the reason for a company choosing to follow a standard? Because what do they have to lose if they don't follow it?
Well, So in Sweden, for instance, there was recently a proposal just at the end of May in 2019 that the licenses which allow electronic communications operators to even be companies and provide services would be subjected to the scrutiny of intelligence services and the security services. So I think the data protection authorities in general do not have the competence to block companies from participating on a market, but law enforcement and security services do. So the companies have really strong incentives to follow the requirements of law enforcement in this respect.
I have an idea for like a different kind of system, because instead of like punishing companies in some way of not following like the idealistic behavior, and the problem about that is that somebody needs to find out that they're not following this as a behavior, so they can just like they're black box, and they can just hide their behavior behind the facade of the company, right? So if you make it the opposite way, so you actually get support from the state, like you get monetary support or something like that, from being, as you can prove yourself that you have a good behavior, so you make a good proof, and every company can make this proof that they have some good behavior, then you would have, everybody would like run towards like, oh yeah, I can prove I'm the best, and then you don't need to have this body that comes in and finds the bad behavior all the time. They can work like, you can inverse the direction of it.
So I think like the general data protection regulation contains some of these mechanisms, codes of conducts and certifications are really technically a part of the European legislator trying to say, listen, there are ways that you can actively demonstrate compliance in ways that we will accept. So the legislator tries, but then the question is, can the regulatory bodies like the DPAs also effectively work with these tools? And I think at this particular time in Europe, there's been no approved code of conduct under the GDPR. The financial mechanism that would encourage companies to sign up to or create a code of conduct is a bit dubious. So the economic model for the companies isn't really there in the legislation. Updating the GDPR within the near future, I would not consider probably feasible. And also it is more likely actually to do damage than to do good. If you look at the e-privacy regulation and all of the member states and companies that are now trying to get special exceptions for themselves. But so there are some of those mechanisms that you could work with by supporting implementing bodies. So rather than making it a political discussion, you try to discuss with, data protection authorities about how do we make the codes of conduct work for us? Can we make certifications work in a good way? Or alternatively, you could support public procurements. So when a municipality is trying to set up a public Wi-Fi network, that translates into the municipality wanting to give somebody money, right? So that's kind of a reward. Can you make that reward contingent on the supplier fulfilling some criteria which are standardized and possible and implementable by industry actors? And in that case, how do you reach out to the municipalities to tell them what the good security standards are? I mean, for Wi-Fi networks in particular, there's a bunch of things that municipalities normally do not do that they could. Using the captive portal standard from the IETF rather than trying to man-in-the-middle attack their users, for instance. But I think in a lot of the cases when they make these procurements, they're just not aware of the technical tools that are out there, so they don't know what requirements to put. And on the European laws, not in all member states, but in some significant number of member states, there's also this ridiculous issue that they can't make, in the procurement requirements, they can only refer to kind of formally adopted, harmonized standards from ETSI, not industry standards. So one could also try to work with public sector institutions to see if there's a way that they could benefit from industry results, rather than just waiting for the European Commission to issue mandates under the Radio Equipment Directive or whatever, because that's just really time consuming and also not very cost efficient. So those are the venues that I see for, none of them are fairly easy, but they're the intuitive venues that I see for getting, for having this reward system and having some benefit from the privacy developments and standards bodies. The 3GPP is just completely different because it's, because there it's actually about like opposing punishments, yeah. So law enforcement is the more credible stick, is essentially the problem. So you need to make somebody else the more credible stick, because I don't think otherwise you, or deal with this fact that member states are not actually contributing to the European legislative, the implementation of the European legislative framework. It's really catastrophic. Even if you were not a privacy-friendly person or a human rights-friendly person, I would assume that you consider this a big problem, because you cannot have companies stuck in the middle of opposing political directions. There's one thing that industry really doesn't like. It's normally being tugged in opposite directions. They want stability and foreseeability. I, of course, would prefer if they ended up to the right of my slides, with data protection and the European Union. But another way to get foreseeability for industry is to simply go in the other direction and say, we'll do whatever the member states say and whatever is required for national security. And it's more like a macro political conflict, I guess.
Do we have any more questions? No? Then let's give a big applause.